Hiç kurumda hiç sandalye verilmiş.
Good evening. You can do better than that. Come on, guys. Good evening.
Good evening.
Much better. All right. Before we start, I'm going to ask everybody, please, either turn off your cell phone or put them on silent. The program tonight had been scheduled for last year, but unfortunately, for some technical reasons, we could not all go. Mr. Tescher had accepted our invitation. We could not conduct this event last year, and we're doing it right here tonight. Mr. Amir Dahi, our president for 2017, unfortunately was not able to attend due to some emergency that he had, and he gave me the honor of introducing Mr. Woodie Tescher to present for us tonight. My name is Bijan Armanpour, member of SIAP, and would like to just make an announcement about SIAP. The design of our new website has been completed and it will be launched very soon. We encourage everyone, each one of you, to go to this website, view it, and enjoy all of the features, all the new features that it's been included in this new website. The other announcement that I'd like to make is about our general events that we conduct here in this room every month and sometimes bi-weekly, every other week. Cultural, educational, and everything that is related to construction and development industry. Our friend, one of our friends, Ms. Andrea Lopez, she's here, right here among us tonight. She, who studies at USC, who is a student at USC, last year, mentioned about this incredible professor at USC, Mr. Woodie Tescher. and Amir, who knows her, I know her, we just took advantage of this and asked her if we can have Mr. Tescher here to do some presentation for us. And fortunately, right away, he accepted our invitation and will give us the honor tonight. Now, Mr. Tescher has a BS, got his BS in architecture at UCLA, right?
Bachelor at USC.
Bachelor at USC, and then your master at
urban design at
UCLA. And
I want to go from side to town.
I'll just give you a brief introduction about him, and then the rest of it I'll let him to complete. Woodie Tescher has more than 40 years of award-winning urban design, planning, and public facilitation experience. He is recognized for advancing the state-of-the-art in the development and application of planning and design approaches that achieve community visions and enhance environmental sustainability, the livability of neighborhoods, and viability of commercial and community centers, including pedestrian-oriented, transit-oriented, mixed-use, live-work, and traditional residential neighborhoods. Now, his experience is extensive. If I want to name all of his experiences, I'll have to stay here the whole night and getting a chance to do anything. But I'll just do some highlights of his experience. Like he has done general plans for many different areas like County of San Diego, Pasadena General Plan, the Habra General Plan, Los Angeles General Plan Framework, and then community plans. A lot of community plans, specific plans and developments, guys like 3rd Street Promenade that we all know here in Los Angeles, Malibu Center specific plan, Beverly Hills Gateway, Exposition Lightway, Jefferson, Industrial Area Guide for Development in Beverly Hills, and the corridor specific Los Angeles coastal transportation, and on and on. I mean, it's pages of experience here. But I'll just give you the headings of these different experiences, like redevelopment and revitalization, visioning and strategic plans, regional plans, development master plans, and then of course speaking, engagement that he has had over the years, and his awards that is extensive, the awards that he has received. Anyways, let's give him a warm reception.
After that build-up, I'm extremely disappointed. I hope not, at least. Well, so first, I want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to be here because this is a topic that I deal with every day in my career. People keep asking me when I'm going to retire, and I say I'm never going to retire because I still love what we're doing and this work out there about making great communities. So I'm going to share a lot of information here today and go through it pretty quickly because I don't want you to be here at 2 o'clock in the morning still to go through all this, but I just want to give you sort of high level and some very specific sort of content as well. But before I begin, I want to know a little bit about you. How many of you are architects? Raise your hands. Okay. How many would you call yourselves urban designers? Okay. How many of you are urban planners? Okay. One I know. She was at USA, since I teach there now as well. So again, thank you. I have, and your
master's in urban planner.
Okay, great, good. So good, welcome. Let me walk through, again, beginning some imagery. From an architect and urban designer, imagery, they should be fired, if you will, et cetera. So I sort of live on that. And so, there we go. Let me go back here. Let's sort of talk a little bit about where we're going. The topic is about making great community places, and I want us to recognize that we are, as we make places, as we make decisions about what lands are to be developed and how they're developed, times are really changing from where we were. We have a lengthy history, particularly here in Southern California. Most of my focus is going to be about California, what we've been doing in California, the Southern California region. We recognize that our practices about and decisions about where housing is to be located and what kind of density and what kind of product is going to be developed in housing and the nature of our commercial centers has really been changing pretty significantly over the last few years. And we're sort of on this precipice of being what was for many years an auto-dominated pattern of development and uses that related to that auto-domination. We're beginning to rethink that. We're rethinking that for a number of key reasons. Another kind of dilemma as we think about is about how we move forward into the future is we are continuing to grow. Our population is increasing, yet we're not keeping up. I think everybody is very familiar. We have a housing crisis in California. We have a housing crisis in Southern California, not only in terms of affordability, but if you look at the numbers of people who have come into or through the natural birth rate in California, the number of housing units are 50% or less than that in terms of keeping up. And we've fallen behind now. I think I heard a statistic the other day that it's been now probably the last time we were sort of equilibrium, if you will, in terms of number of housing units, and population growth is probably about 15 or 20 years ago. So we're digging a hole, digging a deeper hole, and it's going to get worse. We talked about this changing infrastructure. All of you who voted for Measure M, my political statement, thank you, within Los Angeles County area. But we're still not, again, caught up with the transportation infrastructure. We are still very heavily reliant upon the automobile. But what is really interesting is while we're having this shift and rethinking about the scale and the types of development we have within our communities, the market is changing. It's almost a cliche that the millennials are beginning to lead us in directions with their disposable income to a different kind of living environment, both in terms of housing and kinds of community places. They're not necessarily going to the mall anymore. And so what do we do with the mall? They move around differently, et cetera, and that is changing. Our problem is that we're beginning to shift. It's sort of a little bit of a chicken and egg situation in that we're beginning to think a little bit differently. And you'll see some examples here about, for example, mixed-use development or higher dense development. But particularly here in Southern California, particularly in Los Angeles, we'll talk a little bit about measures before we're through, et cetera, we're not doing it really well. We're thinking about these projects that are changing from our traditional single-family house into projects that are somewhat denser, somewhat more mixed use, et cetera, but we're not thinking about them cohesively. We're developing a project on one site, and then the next project like that is maybe a mile away or half mile away, particularly on our corridors as well. So it's a series of fragments that doesn't create place, and it becomes really the opposite of creating good places, et cetera, because of the fragmentation, et cetera. And then also that basically a premise, just in a philosophy of my whole life, is architects, planners, and urban designers really need to work together. Because if we're going to truly create a great community, great places for our community, it's not just having a great building by itself, but it needs to think about how that building fits in context to other buildings, how it fits in context to the public realm, as well as making wonderful places. And I'll share some examples of this as well. But what's really interesting, we've reached this period by the fact that we are on this pendulum swing of thinking differently about how we grow, particularly in Southern California, of intense community opposition. People who are fearing change. Measure X is an indication of that very clearly. So let me start, and I'm going to go through this really briefly, to go back in time to sort of remind ourselves of our patterns of urbanization, of really where we started. The various era in terms of settlements, we had the native tribes and the native peoples on the landscape. And as you look at this, these images, what's really sort of interesting to think about is they clustered the living together. It's not spread out, it is clustered together. It's a sense of community, it's a communal activity in terms of sharing in terms of food, sharing in terms of economy, sharing in terms of sociology. And as the European migration came into the United States, we had similar kinds of, particularly look at the East Coast villages. We began to develop along the coast, and along the coast, again, the noticing you see there is again a concentration of people. It was the place for living, it was the place for commerce, it was the place for socialization, place for religious activity, etc. Everything was got together in a compact place that was accessible, that you don't see on this image cars. You see horses at best, but you see a lot of people, pedestrian, walking around from place to place to place. And this bore out in communities throughout the East Coast. This is the Boston. I always love this image because the diagram, particularly the black block diagram up there, is the street network in downtown Boston. What drove that street network, unlike our highways and freeways, was the horse and the carriage, how the wagons would move from place to place to place, from origin to destination, deliver goods, services, etc. And that created what is now, for any of you, have any of you driven around Boston or tried to? It's a nightmare, as you well appreciate, etc. as a result of that. What's interesting is that over time, as the country grew and we expanded west through the railroad, along the railroad routes, that the character and the urban form of the communities that were along those railroad routes were very similar. They were, again, concentrated places like the native resource tribes, like the early settlements on the East Coast and in port cities, etc., where uses were concentrated, living, commerce, etc., and they were not spread out. They were surrounded by agriculture, were the places of production of food, but indeed the actual core for living and commerce was indeed concentrated, except for those who were out there. And interestingly enough, even the settlement of where we are in Los Angeles, this is the original settlement image of the core of the Pueblo, Los Angeles area, etc. And Southern California and Los Angeles County was a series of ranchos. And if the ranchos had these settlements, which, if you again look at the slide, shared the same characteristics you saw in the earlier slides. This was our heritage in our beginnings. Amazing to me is we had mixed use development. You know, this radical idea that's seemingly coming back. We had people living on top of actually transit lines here in downtown Los Angeles in the early settlements. Partly because we also had one of the most sophisticated in that era transit systems. We had something called the red car, which actually provided rail transit throughout the Southern California area, from the core being downtown to the Long Beach San Pedro area, out east San Gabriel Valley, out south into what is now Orange County. So we had this fabric, this infrastructure around which communities grew in Southern California. Again, so it was a transit-oriented premise and framework in which we grew in Southern California. So in all these, I repeated these, and I'll go through these quickly, the sort of common elements in all of these places. The development throughout the nation, and California was the old colonial pattern of grid streets, connected streets, etc., compact form of development and mixed use being together, housing and commerce being in the same place. Cities were recognized as regional centers for economic activity, and the agriculture was outside of those boundaries of the city in the peripheral areas. Communities were interconnected among themselves. They were walkable kinds of places, etc. And they all had a sense of local identity, back to that image of the red car lines in Southern California, places like Pasadena, places like Ontario, and the San Gabriel Valley and Chino East, San Bernardino. They were all separate communities. Pomona was a separate community. Did it all sprawl together? It was a separate place that had a mixture of uses within those communities themselves. Well, what over time happened is all of that development occurred without formally a plan, or without regulations, or without guidance or blueprint about how it's going to occur. It occurred effectively what I would call a laissez-faire direction. So people would be making decisions about where properties were to be developed, but without a conscious master plan of any kind or any kind of regulation. And over time in the United States, we began to see the experience of good things and bad things being located right next to each other, which were incompatible with each other. So we had the historic factories and meat rendering facilities all mixed together. We had tenement housing where the poor were actually, they may be physically right next to where they were, but they were not well maintained, etc. So the results of a laissez-faire kind of direction where we didn't have any control led us to some very significant issues. In that era, there were a number of plans being prepared of urban designers, of visionary architects, landscape architects said, we can do things better. And so we had plans like the plan for Washington, D.C., the L'Enfant plan that began to organize, create districts, create places, better public spaces. The 1909 plan for Chicago that looked at, again, this network and infrastructure of greenways and green spaces to tie things together, etc. We had the World's Columbian Exposition, the White City, etc. It was intended to be a model in opposition, in effect, as a counterbalance to those tenements and those incompatible uses being located with next to each other. And we had in Europe, particularly in England, something called the Garden City movement, which is really an think of the antecedent of urban, if you will, in terms of the nature as well. But all of that was laissez-faire. None of that was indeed any kind of regulation set in place, any kind of rules really officially being set in place through any kind of control through, let's say, a governmental agency. That changed in 1916 when New York City, the first city in the United States, actually enacted a zoning ordinance that basically said we've got to separate those uses that are incompatible from each other, and we've got to place some controls on it. So we need to regulate use, we need to regulate density, and we need to regulate how it relates to the infrastructure system. And that was followed up by two important, for any of you who are planners, 2 or 3 of you are planners, if you ever take the ICP exam, first question on the exam are these two, basically federally enacted legislation during a very conservative presidential era when Herbert Hoover was president of the United States, who was very conservative, but enacted legislation, one called the Standard Enabling Zoning Act, which is a federal act that says states and cities and counties can make decisions and actually enact laws legally authorizing cities to do that create the separation of land uses and create and address these impacts. The following act in 27, the Standard Planning Enabling Act, basically then said, okay, not only can you zone, but you can create plans and you can create bodies called planning commissions, which actually have a responsibility for reviewing development applications and can make decisions for approval of whether you can build or not build. These are two fundamentals about in the world in which we now live in planning. Well, as a result of this, because the notion was separation, we began to have our single-family housing over here, and we put all the other people, the poor people, over in the multifamily over here, and we put the industrial over here, and we separated the uses. So we no longer had that walkability. It basically drove the creation and the dependence upon automobile, because rather than having this mixing, our rules and our regulations actually inhibited mixing of uses and inhibited density as well. In LA, we still had, because we had the roots of the seeds of some really kind of great kind of neighborhood kinds of clusters themselves, but over time we added a freeway system, and it was designed to be a 4-mile grid, and the intent was you could drive anywhere across the Southern California area in a very fast pattern, with the Hollywood freeway always looking like that. When did the last Hollywood freeway last look like that? And what I found in this image is actually pretty early. It didn't look like that. The top slide as well. So we created the conduit, and what happened over time is all of these pieces of properties that were then nodes of communities and separated, filled in with housing. So what was intended to be the separation in those roads never, when they were designed and laid out and when they were planned, were never ever anticipating that all of those intersections between that grid would fill up with housing and development. The notion was you would still have the separation of communities like you did on the rail line, but over time, as we grew, particularly after World War II, all those spaces filled in, and that capacities that were intended to be provided and the efficiency of that, we, of course, know about that slide. I love this first scene from La La Land if you haven't seen it, because I think this is the way that the industry related to the presence of the automobile was a joyous situation. But again, if you've seen La La Land, all those cars are stopped. They're not moving anywhere as well. And as a result, we created this really kind of interesting, by sprawling and growing out, we created this kind of diversity. We had some good housing, single family, and Pasadena, the Monroe District in West Hollywood, the multifamily in the courtyard units that are great pieces of architecture and era that created great places. But we also began to develop like this. We began to create neighborhoods where the primary image on this slide, very typical of our neighborhoods, is the automobile and the garage, and what had been a front yard disappeared. What had been that orientation, eyes on the street, creating culture in the neighborhood and community are lost. We lost that, indeed, identity of a community. And to this day, by so many people, when I go to a public meeting, oppose density, that we did way, way too much of this. And indeed, not the most attractive buildings, not the most suitable in terms of a living environment, so we keep hearing opposition to density because of, I think, the precedence of that as well. We also created these massive shopping centers and places, be malls and commercial centers, that's predominated not so much by the building, but predominated by the acres and acres of asphalt for the parking, suitable for the space as well. And then we also then separated our commercial and business parks out into the hinterland as well. And we began to use up all the flatlands and began to say, okay, well, where do we go if we've used up all the flatlands? And we began to intrude and change the landscape of our hillside areas as well. And this is an image, this is now about 10 years old, in terms of particularly the image to the right of how we have urbanized that space in Southern California, and also the fact that we have eaten up what I would call all the good land, if you will, and we need to be thinking about if we're going to grow, we either move into these more what I would call sensitive areas, or we need to begin to think about reusing that property where we have that flat land and development. And indeed, as a result of this, I don't need to go through all these in detail. I think the most significant issue that surfaced today that we as planners and communities are dealing with is the impacts of climate change. As a result of our use, we have the impacts of our energy consumption, air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, loss of resources, loss of agricultural land, et cetera, without going through everything that's on the site. So we've had some very significant environmental consequences of those patterns of development. We've also had significant economic impacts. There are thousands, I would say thousands, hundreds of miles of places like Vermont Avenue or San Fernando Road or other roads throughout Southern California. There are these narrow strip commercial corridors. And over time, functioning and economically vital retail uses recognize that these very shallow parcels are not suitable for viable commercial uses today in our century. Why? Because these uses, when they were built, didn't have parking. So where do you provide the parking in these corridors? Secondarily, if you're having truck access to indeed provide goods to that store or whatever that retail establishment is, you need to have trucks coming in and out. And when you have these thin corridors abutting particularly single-family neighborhoods, you've got a conflict. So even though we've segregated the commercial from the residential, we're running into the same kind of conflicts we had back in the sort of laissez-faire days. So for many years also, until recently here in Los Angeles, we lost our businesses in our commercial cores. LA downtown is having a resurgence, but over a period of time lost the department stores. I hear Nordstrom announced they're going to build in downtown LA. I heard that on the news today. So it shows you the evolution of what's happening in our communities. But there are lots of other communities where that has not happened. Santa Ana, I could go through a whole list of other kinds of communities where that's not happened. And then we also, the third level of what we've had is we've had lifestyle impacts. We are in a generation where the medical profession tells us the younger generation are not going to live as long as the older generation, which is the first time in the history. We've always had that escalating cycle where we live longer, et cetera, and the kids always live longer than the parents, et cetera. And that's changing because of issues like obesity, where the kids and asthma and other pollution results from pollution, but also from the inactivity because most people will drive their kids to school, drop them off instead of kids walking to school. There are recreational devices. More people will sit there and play on their computer and not get out and be active. All the contributing issues, et cetera. And so we've had these significant impacts as well. So about, my gosh, it must be now about 15, 20 years ago, a group of architects and planners got together and created what's considered in many to be the manifesto. They went up to the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite and sat down and basically, among themselves, agreed that we can't continue this way. We as planners, we as architects can't continue to move in this direction. We need to begin to reverse this as well. So they established a series of what are called the Ahwahnee principles, et cetera, which basically, when you look at the words here, these words are very much like those words that characterize the initial patterns of development in the United States. Compact communities and density. Complete and integrated communities rather than separating the housing and the commercial. These need to be integrated closer to each other as well. We must have mixed use, we must have schools and parks within this area. We must provide for a range of housing and affordable housing within our communities as well. They need to be connected, they need to be walkable, they need to be transit-oriented, and each community needs to have a well-defined edge rather than sprawling continuously ad nauseum out into the landscape. And there needs to be places where there are permanent open space farmland. These are the basic principles that provided foundations for what we now call smart growth, as we begin to think about how we, in the planning profession, how we shape our communities. The American Planning Association has endorsed that concept of smart growth. It's the course I teach at SE called Smart Growth versus Urban Sprawl. That Andrew was in that particular course as well. Without getting into this, it also has become the mantra of a group called the Congress for New Urbanism. I am not an active member because I have issues with their architectural direction, to create Disneyland architecture, which is kind of what they like to do. Hopefully there's no disciple of CNU here. But the principles, and a lot of my architect friends basically will never join CNU, but they, at the same time, endorse the principles that CNU professes, and these are the basic principles as well. But also what's very important is happening to us, and I mentioned this a little bit later, the demand for the traditional large, stick-built, single-family detached house, the demand for the type of house, the demand for transportation is changing for a couple of key reasons. We have an aging population. Aging population is looking for downsizing in many sense, especially after the kids leave the house. We also have millennials, a new generation, whose preferences are for something else. Quick story. Working a couple years ago in the city of Pasadena General Plan, we had a public workshop, about 300 people there, all basically saying, we've done our job in Pasadena, we have transit, we have mixed use, etc. We want no more of it. It's too dense. These were all people who were not living in the environment. They were all living in their single-family house up by the Rose Bowl, in the Linda Vista area, etc. They were complaining. After about 2 hours, a younger gentleman, about 28, stood up in the room and said, I've been listening to all you folks here tonight. And he said, I'm actually kind of offended. He said, I and my wife moved to Pasadena about 4 or 5 years ago. At this point in time, my wife got a job in downtown Los Angeles. We weren't quite ready to move to downtown Los Angeles, but we wanted to be close to our job. So we found that there was a transit line, the Gold Line, which is a very slow line, by the way. But a Gold Line connecting Pasadena, she could get on transit and commute to downtown LA. And they were from Chicago. And they said, we actually had a car and found the need to have a car in Chicago. We came and moved to Pasadena. And in moving to Pasadena, we actually sold our car because we have found there's some incredible mix of use that we don't need an automobile by living in Pasadena, not only because of transit, because of a mix and density. I can walk to 3 different grocery stores from where I live in downtown. I can walk to a 21-screen art-like movie theater, great movies. I can go to a great bookstore, still exists in Pasadena, Romans, etc. So I can do all this. And he pointed his finger at the chair of the Planning Commission, and he said, I know you live in a nice green and green California Craftsman house. And I'm not going to try, and none of my colleagues are trying to take that away from you. We want you to have that choice for that great single family house and that well-designed house. But you should not take away the right for me or my generation to live in a different kind of housing product. I thought that was a good time to shut off the public meeting, by the way. But we have a whole different market of people out there who are saying the traditional form and node of development, they want to be in walkable places. They want to be able to not have to be on the car for a 2-hour commute from home to work. They want to be able to access it easily, etc. And they want the kind of amenity. So as these ideas are beginning to play out, those ideas about compact development, etc., there have been a number of planning and regulatory initiatives. This was one of the first in the Sacramento region. This is not just the county of Sacramento, but it's Yolo County, it's Sutter County, it's El Dorado County, etc. It's a 5-county area. And they basically were challenged by the fact that they were growing in that typical sort of suburban pattern, continuing to march out into agricultural lands, and very much concerned that if they continue business as usual, they're going to eat up a lot of resources and they're going to create significant distribution and need to use the automobile and continue to do that. This is a diagram. They sat down, this wasn't government, this was developers, these were architects, these were community activists, these were environmental folks, these were every spectrum of the community. These were financial institutions all sat down in a room in various groups. And they created first this diagram, and the pink area in this diagram is if the Sacramento region continues to grow as we have grown, business as usual, those are the lands that are going to be eaten up by additional development. So they then said, okay, given the principles, you saw that list a few minutes ago about compact walkable transit places, right? Again, strip corridors that are underutilized. We have vacant properties that are out there, etc. So we have places that we can use. Every community has, at least upper right, has the grocery store anchored center. I'm going to show you an alternative to that in terms of how that can be repositioned. With the changing economics in the economy going, especially we keep seeing even more substantially this year and this Christmas, to online shopping, indeed malls, the traditional commercial center that's auto-oriented, are disappearing from our landscape or being repositioned. And I'll show you some ideas about that in a moment as well. So we have these huge asphalt areas where more land is given away not to the building footprint but to the car, that have that opportunity to be rethought about what can be done within those areas. Topanga Plaza is an example as well. We also have lands that are no longer needed for the function they had. Upper left, Portland, Oregon, the northern portion that was the areas for all the commerce on the river used for manufacturing and used for shipping. I'll show you the after of this one in a few minutes in Manhattan Beach, which was an old pottery making factory right in the core of downtown Manhattan Beach, if any of you know Manhattan Beach at all. We also have the classic, all the surface parking lots in downtown. This now is thankfully about 5 years old because those are disappearing pretty quickly as well. But those are all resources that we can grow on. We don't need to demolish buildings. We can actually use what is in effect surplus land that is currently used for parking within those areas. The other driver that we have right now is the fact that we're developing a robust, and even more robust now, this is the new map, series of transit lines and transit stations, including Expo and others, but even more significantly to the airport, and ultimately even more significantly the one that will go out to line out to the valley. We have opportunities as well. But it's not all construction on those parking lots or filling those in with new buildings. We have the opportunity that we have this incredibly rich resource of older buildings that have the opportunity to be reused. This is the old Howard Hughes hangar at Playa Vista now, et cetera, that is going to be reused for fairly creative spaces. But we have older buildings in all of them being adaptively reused and changed, where rather than tearing down and demolishing the building, some creative designers are coming in and repurposing those buildings as well. And then sacrosanct, having worked on the general plan framework for LA, policy number 1, ye shall not develop in single-family neighborhoods. Well, you can, and I'll show you some ideas about how you can begin to think about using your single-family neighborhoods without destroying the context. But let me talk first about some important principles. So when we're thinking about where the location of that development should be, and we're now not hopefully be too critical, but it's appropriate to be critical of the city of Los Angeles. I understand Measure S, because the city of Los Angeles has not been following its own plans about where growth should occur. This goes back to Cal Hamilton, I think it was early 70s, late 60s, called Concept Los Angeles. And basically, and he was a very creative planner, except for skywalks in downtown Los Angeles, give Cal his credit. But basically, the notion was basically that Los Angeles should be a series of centers, the round dot. There's a core concentration, just like those earlier slides and those earlier principles, where all the commerce is concentrated, the higher density development, et cetera, and then intervening space be lower density, and that these be connected by transit. In the original version of the centers concept for Los Angeles back in the late 60s, those dots were different size. This became, first political issue was that it became a political map. At that time, when that plan was adopted by the City Council in Los Angeles, each council district said, I want to have a dot equally as big as everybody else's dot. So a dot for, let's say, San Pedro became as big as the dot for downtown LA. And I think there are two radically different places, and most people would agree in terms of use and density, et cetera. But anyway, this is the concept that has been driving Los Angeles with the notion of the sketch that is illustrative of this concentration and development, and the names, I'm still able to find some of this imagery as well. That was followed up by the general plan framework. Diagrams, which is still the operational overarching plan for the city of Los Angeles. Go on the city's Los Angeles website, look up the planning department, and where it says general plan, the framework plan is the overarching plan. It reinvented the center's concept and also looked at transitioning the corridors. So you have the center, but also, unlike center's concept, basically said that these linear corridors, these transit lines, are also places that we could begin to think about opportunities for change. And those linear corridors not necessarily be as dense as the core, but again, be somewhat more dense than adjacent areas. So they can also be corridors that heal and reconnect neighborhoods that are on either side of the community itself. So this is just an illustration of what's part of the framework. This is some of the different diagrams. It created a nomenclature, which is also a nomenclature related to urban design. If you look at the general plan framework, there are principles about design for each of these areas: the regional core, regional center, community centers, mixed-use boulevards, etc. Yet what has happened? That red star is the location of the proposed Millennium project, which, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to say thumbs up, thumbs down, personally from the project, that project's in the wrong location. It does not follow the own plan that the city had. Now, maybe it is the right location, but the dilemma in the city of LA is the city of LA has not kept their plans up to date. The average community plan in the city of Los Angeles is 25 to 35 years old. And the plans were never updated, etc. So this is which is causing one of the, if you will, precursors to this Measure S. Some of the fact that one of the projects is being considered as driving Measure S, it's in the wrong place, at least under the current rules. Telling you a story that the city doesn't believe or enforce its own rules, which is really one of our problems we're facing in California. Now I want to take this a little bit further. This is Jefferson-La down the street, transit station area. We walked into this with the notion that we're going to have a transit station parking structure within the area, and the community said, no way, we're not going to accept any development. We had placards at the beginning of the meeting. We basically worked through about a 4.5-hour workshop, turned the community around, had high fives when we were walking out, because what we did is we took off the table the traditional discussion of density, etc. What we said, what's missing in this community? What is desperately needed in this community that's going to make something better, that's going to make a community a great place? We need greenways, we need green spaces, we need kind of amenity that is missing in this community. And we worked with the community and economists to in fact create a density of development and a mix of uses that we could take the revenue, excess revenue off of these projects and create incentives where a developer could build 2 or 3 more stories if they created the green space that is not necessarily nexus required by code for them to provide on site. And we work with the developers, they bought into this. So this plan, you will see, this is Jefferson, this is La Cienega, this is the transit station. I won't go through all the mix of uses. We, of course, one use we're not going to change is the C's Candy headquarters. That's inviolate, trust me, for all the planners in the area. And we had great community support as we walked out of this process. And this is the notion of taking large parcels, breaking them down to a smaller grid of buildings. We obviously have an Eric and Moss building in the area, so the shape is a little bit different than the other sort of rectangular buildings within the area. And keeping many of the uses we created. I don't need to go through this in detail, but this was basically the plan that was endorsed by the community. As you look at this, particularly look at this area on this northwest corner, we took a single ownership and a single parcel, broke it into super parcel with no interior streets, broke it down to a smaller grid. And so we have the transit station, we have multifamily, mixed use, commercial services, employment, parks, etc. And what we did, this is that block right there, was we purposely created, if you will notice, a modulation of building form and mass so it steps down to the adjoining single-family neighborhood. So it's very strongly urban design driven. Urban design driven by having green spaces, orienting buildings around the green spaces, urban design oriented by creating an interior grid, and urban design oriented by creating connections in the community. The next image is of the project that is now being entitled for that property. I think you will have to say it doesn't look like it. Okay, it violates every single principle of urban design that was developed in that plan. Lack of political will. Now, I'm a strong opponent to Measure S, but this would almost make me want to sign a petition on Measure S, because the designers worked, the community went through the process of buying into the other diagram. Community people who said, we will not accept density. And then they see this, they bought into the other plan, and what they were promised is not being delivered. And that's pretty unfortunate as well. So, we're there. So some other basic principles about placement. As I said, it's architecture, but it's also not only the architecture, but it's that combination with streetscapes and great public spaces as well. And it's how these pieces fit together. This is from the plans for the city of Sacramento, which shows you that every single category of use is not based upon one building on one site, zoning, but it's how all of the buildings cumulatively fit along the grid of streets and how they fit into open space. And you will see there are, in every category in this plan that starts with urban design, not use, not density, but urban design principles that are going to guide how development is to be laid out. And this is just one section on an urban neighborhood. This is how buildings should be located. The typical mall where you build or the commercial center, bring the buildings to the street, orient around open space, and then hire it. So there's about 25 of these, which I'm not going to go through. But the notion is that traditionally planners and zoning ordinances only looked at the one site. You know, what can you build on this particular property? What this does is say, okay, if you're going to build on this property, what's going to happen on the next property? What's going to happen across the street? And how do these fit together? And how do those buildings relate to the street to actually create a place and a community rather than just development on a single and an individual parcel themselves? Also very importantly is the notion that we as a principle is needed to develop more sustainably, be it buildings, Cal Green and beyond Cal Green, and also how we create our streetscapes and how we are efficient use of landscape materials and downtown LA, how we create an urban bioswale that takes all the runoff here and then feeds into the drainage system as well. And then I'm going to go by this real fast, is the notion of eco-districts, which basically takes the idea, again, of not just the individual parcel, but in Little Tokyo, how buildings of multiple parcels can begin to be fit together and how the public realm can be designed to be less energy consumptive, less water consumptive, less resource dependent upon use of materials as well. Integration of open spaces, you've seen the LA River Plan. I don't need to go through in details of how we can weave together, how we can begin to reuse freeway caps. This is the plan, current plan for the plan in Glendale, which if any of them go forward, this one's the one that's likely to go forward first. It's moving pretty quickly as well. And then the notion of integrating, is when we have infill, we often think about, and one of my criticisms about downtown Los Angeles where I work, is there's not much attention given to the fact that we're looking and need to look at that green space and that public realm, et cetera. It's about the building, but it's not about the public realm. And we're now doing things like having, basically using spaces along the street, at the curbs, et cetera, for parklets and other kinds of open space amenities. And we are beginning to integrate open spaces. The other notion that's really important is the principle, is we want to create good spaces, not to do or design a building to be this size. This is very successful. The Grove, this is the 3rd Street side of the Grove. It's not the interior space on the Grove. From the street, and we have dense housing over here on the other side of 3rd Street, etc. And we created a blank wall. Again, we tried to make it fancy by painting it, but it's a blank wall. It has no indoor-outdoor relationship to the street. It ignores, it turns its back to the street and creates an interior street which basically says we don't care about the community. We're ignoring the community. Now, Rick Caruso, to his credit, did a better job in Glendale because he did relate to the street, to Brand. It's not about architecture here, but it is about the basic notion that the eyes, in this case, are on the street, and indeed it's not a blank wall, and it's fenestrated, and it's detailed, and create modular mass along the streetscape to create something different. And you can do that also for residential. That big podium you saw for Jefferson-La, Cienega, this is the San Diego, where the buildings are actually begin to orient and create this rhythm along the street frontage, rather than elevating and completely separating the residences from the street, which actually provides eyes on and additional safety onto the street themselves. Also, the whole notion of orienting buildings around public plazas is a basic policy. Not only the other slides before of having different sites create spaces around their multiple in the streetscape, but also the buildings themselves can be oriented around it as well. And then your notion of having indoor-outdoor activity transparency. I worked on the first West Hollywood general plan, and in the first general plan in West Hollywood, they had to write an interim zoning ordinance because everybody hates the County of Los Angeles zoning ordinance, which they were operating under, etc. So we want to do something different. And so one of the questions was, what are the overarching, because we're not going to have time right now to rewrite the whole ordinance. What's the most important thing? What was really the most important thing that came out of the public discussions is we want to be a pedestrian-oriented city, which was interesting to me. I thought some other things like parking and some other things might surface in that process as well. But he said we want to be pedestrian-oriented. So we created a simple one-liner in the ordinance, the zoning ordinance that said all the buildings shall be located and built to the sidewalk frontage. The building shall be 70% transparent, and parking shall be to the rear or in subterranean structure. One-liner in the zoning ordinance. That time that was radical. Trust me, we had actually people from New York call us and say, what are you doing this for? So, and again, the notion of how it's not just designing the interior of the building, but very importantly, a good friend of mine, not name dropping, is Tom Main, and he and I have had lots of discussions about how his buildings, not all of them really address the street really well, and you need to begin to get more conscious about indeed that relationship to the street frontage as well. So let me quickly go through some examples.